If you really want to embrace that vintage life, you can be a complete wackadoodle like some guy I saw on a handshift Harley riding down Long Beach Boulevard the other week, or you can be a rational person and unfortunately have to spend a little bit more money, but have both. Have an actual vintage bike and then have a modern vintage bike.
I want to stay on the topic because I think it's interesting to talk about bikes that really feel like they hit that vintage feel. It can be a Bonneville from 2005 or a Sport Classic, as Ari talked about, from 2005 or whatever. Bikes that have been made in the past 15 or 20 years to look like bikes from whatever, 45 to 65 years ago, and which ones sort of really hit that tone. And I feel like the Royal Enfields is a great call out because even the ones that are supposed to be more modern are still feel pretty old.
They're stuck in amber.
Yeah, a little bit. I guess we've like sort of talked about the modern Triumph. I mean, Triumph is still, I think, sort of leading the way with all these bikes because if you ride a 2023 Bonneville T100, you get wide spacing in the gear ratios. You get like this sort of lumbering, thumpy engine, and of course it looks beautiful, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, because they sell a crap ton of them. But what are some other bikes are there any other bikes that jump to mind for you guys? When you ride them, you're like, yeah, this like, whether it's good or bad, is really hitting the notes of an old bike.
Well, first we should qualify what riding a true vintage bike
Yeah, actually.
not only feels like, sounds like, smells like. There's a lot that goes with riding an actual vintage bike.
Perfect.
So they tend to shake quite a bit. All modern motorcycles are balanced to some degree, whether they have an actual balance shaft or they just use enough cylinders that they have inherent balance. Old bikes, they usually shake. They usually vibrate quite a bit as you rev them up through the rev range. They usually have cable-operated brakes that are terrible, drum brakes, or very feeble disc brakes if they were on the cutting edge of technology at the time. And they smell. They smell like hot oil because they were air-cooled and they got really hot and they wept oil, not necessarily enough to drip, but enough to escape so that you could smell it. And they smelled like gasoline because they were carbureted and they didn't have all the emissions compliant stuff we have now that keeps everything so tidy. So as far as that is concerned, when you got on a 2005 Sport 1000, it didn't sound and necessarily feel and do all the things, but it has just enough of that reminiscence that you're like, cool, I'm not riding a fully modern motorcycle. And I think a lot of it has to do with modern motorcycles putting performance first and being very much about going quickly and handling well.
I think there's one that they were going after the modern vintage class, but I felt like it didn't have enough character. I felt like they made it too refined, and that one is when Honda brought to America the CB 1100. I don't know if you guys ever rode that first gen.
Sure.
Only goes 109 miles an hour, as I recall.
I can't speak to that, but I remember we had.
It's very governed.
We had got one when I was working at the shop down in Tennessee. We got one of the first models that came into the U.S. And I was really excited to ride it as someone that kind of liked this class of motorcycles quite a bit. And I remember taking it out for a ride as soon as it hit the showroom floor and just being like, oh. It was just very vanilla. It just didn't. It was almost like in true Honda form. They just made it. They made it too good and too smooth, and
And
there wasn't.
It looked really handsome. Still does look really handsome. It's a beautiful bike. The big 4 pipes coming out of the front of the engine. But yeah, it's sort of like what you wanted was a little bit more like heat in its blood, right? You wanted a little bit more.
You wanted to shake
like
a little bit more
or something like that.
Yeah.
It's funny, right? It's funny how you ride one bike and you're like, I can't even leave a stoplight without stalling it. So, and I'm pretty good at riding motorcycles, so I think this is quote unquote too much character. And then you ride another bike and you're like, there's not enough. Like I almost want some of that stuff that's not as good, right? You're reaching for.
It's a hard line to walk for manufacturers.
Yeah, it really is. That's really funny. Manufacturers are trying to hit a moving target too, because certain people want certain things. Like someone like our dad's age might ride a bike and the grabby clutch and the fluffy fueling, as Ari pointed out, or the smelling like hot oil when you park it. Like that's the kind of stuff that would scratch what they're trying to itch, right? But
on the flip side, someone that's coming out of a Honda Civic and they're getting into motorcycling for the first time, they're gonna be like, "What the hell's wrong with this contraption? I don't like. Why is this such a piece of junk?" And they don't have the context.
I remember Ari and I doing a test years ago when the BMW R9T first came out. BMW sort of relaunched, or not even relaunched, but just sort of like repurposed the older engine from flagship GSs and flagship BMWs before, which was like the oil-cooled single plate dry clutch, much older transmission, and they put that in this sort of steampunk cafe racer thing, as I've called it before.
It had incredible brakes and really good suspension.
Right. So,
but they just used an older motor.
Right. And so I remember doing a test with that bike and the Thruxton at the time. I'm not sure if you remember this. And we were riding around downtown Long Beach doing photos. And we traded bikes, right? As we often did with testing. We're sort of like, oh, let's just trade bikes real quick. We'll try the other one so we can, affect our notes in a positive way.
Which Thruxton? Was it the 1200 or was the older?
It was the Thruxton 1200. It
Okay.
was the first generation of the Thruxton R, I believe, which had the sort of like
Yeah,
high
I
output
remember the
1200
R.
engine.
Okay.
And the higher grade suspension, I believe.
Yeah, it had Olin suspension, and the 9T was also a 1200cc twin. So they're like on paper very, very kind of like well matched. And I remember, Ari, I don't know if you remember this, but you got on the R9T and I got on the Thruxton, and we rode around the block to catch up to the photographer. And we stopped at a traffic light, and you opened your visor and you said, "Yeah, this bike's better." About the R9T compared to the Thruxton. And ultimately, what we learned in that test was that the Thruxton, in many ways, was just much better. It was, first of all, styled better. It had beautiful, like thoughtful round blinkers and crafted taillight and a sort of like beautifully designed everything from start to finish. Whereas the 9T had like parts bin mirrors and blinkers, had the same blinkers as like other bikes in BMW's line that were modern and not vintage at all. And it didn't quite hit all the same notes aesthetically, but when you rode it, it really like it vibrated and it shook and it had that weird oil smell and it kind of like it felt more raw and real and kind of like it was really plucking at your heartstrings. And the Thruxton was almost
more
too
of a
good.
time machine.
Yeah,
it was more of a time machine, but it still worked well. I remember it handling exceptionally well.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've lost some of that in the current R9Ts. They've kind of like chipped away at the quality of the suspension and brakes. And
right.
Just focusing on like the mechanical aspect, and Ari, you're somebody that is obviously pretty talented when it comes to being able to work on things. Do you want to have valve service intervals of 12,000, or do you want to be able to adjust the valves with a screwdriver, but you have to do it every 3,000? And then if you're aiming at a new rider, which is better, which is worse, So I think even just with some of the basics of mechanics, it's a hard line to walk.
Indeed. Well, the one thing they're all doing correctly is electronic ignition and fuel injection. Those are the two big hurdles that someone who's not comfortable working on a motorcycle shouldn't have to deal with.
Can you
And
explain
thankfully
that
they
for
don't
the
have to.
audience?
Yeah, so back in the day, they had points ignition. It was basically mechanical and it relied on little rocker arm moving around, and you had to make sure the timing on that sucker was correct and the gap was correct, and occasionally you actually had to replace that and the condenser, and you had to check it fairly frequently, whereas modern motorcycles, the ignition system, other than replacing spark plugs, is completely non-serviceable. And when I say non-serviceable, I mean you don't have to service it, which, for guys our dad's age is just amazing, because that was a huge, you could, if your timing was screwed up or your points, that's true. That is true. If the timing was screwed up, I mean, your bike might not start, it might run poorly. There's so many issues that could happen. And likewise with the carburetor, like we all take for granted now that, I got on the motorcycle at 7 a.m. this morning. It was the coldest, Spurgeon, it was the coldest day we have had in LA. I believe it was 38 degrees. And a fuel-injected motorcycle just starts right up and idles. Whereas if you were on an old bike,
pull the choke.
You probably have to choke it for a while. It might fall on its face a few times. You'd literally need to let the engine get warm before you could reliably ride the thing. So those are just two that nobody, I don't think anyone wants to see that come back. We don't need that kind of character anymore.
And just to take it one step further for what Ari's talking about, when we're talking about ignition on motorcycles, or in mechanical terms, this is what makes the spark plug spark, and it's what sets the gasoline on fire. And then when we're talking about carburetors, carburetors basically were little devices that mixed the air and the fuel together as the fuel came out of the fuel tank and allowed the mixture to be sucked into the engine. Does that sound like a pretty rudimentary explanation, Ari?
That's terrific. I appreciate you doing that, because I wouldn't have considered doing it.
I think it's interesting because like some of this, like if you are just getting into motorcycling now and this is your first experience with motorcycling, what are the chances that you're going to find a carburetor on a motorcycle?
A modern motorcycle? Very, very rare. I think the XR 650 maybe is still carbureted, and maybe the DRZ 400 is still carbureted, which is, as I understand it, I don't think there's any, I don't know how much truth there is. Like those bikes have remained unupdated, because if they update anything, it's kind of like the carburetor's grandfathered in. But typically speaking, carburetors are undesirable because they're not good for the end user, but primarily they're not allowed anymore because they're very quote unquote dirty. They have to have a vent on them to atmosphere, and fuel is a very volatile fluid, especially when it's sitting in the sun. It wants to evaporate, and that's how we get smog in LA and air pollution all around the world.
Yeah, on the topic of wrenchability, Ari, I'm kind of curious if there are people listening and they're thinking, well, I do want to get a quote unquote modern bike, or like I like the idea of a modern classic. I do think that like buying a vintage and a true vintage bike from 1972 or 1968 or whatever is a bad idea. So I would like to get a new bike, but I also want to spin wrenches. I think I want to learn how to work on it to some extent. Like what's the nexus there for you? Like what's a good, is there an entry point that you feel like this bike will be rewarding to ride and kind of like, or at least useful and practical, but when you take it apart, it won't be insanely hard to put back together?
Yeah, I think maybe, any of the modern Hondas, they don't have a whole lot in that vintage category. They've got what's the latest one? The SCR?
SCL 500.
Yeah, SCL 500. Yeah.
But that's a liquid cooled bike.
like,
would you reach for air cooling just because it's simpler, or is that just sort of like pinning yourself down in a way that's not necessary?
Yeah, I feel like exactly pinning yourself down. If you're like, oh, well, I want a wrench on it. Like the beauty of the modern vintage bike is you don't really have to. Like you're not going to have to put a new con rod on it at any point or like cut new valve seats or anything. Like it's going to go for 60, 70, 80,000 miles. So if you do aspire to change your own oil and check your own tire pressure and lubricate your own chain, like that's kind of as far as you have to take it. Yes, maybe valve clearances. I think I wouldn't ever compromise on behalf of simpler valve clearances that have to happen more frequently. I would rather just have it happen at 12,000 miles. And if I'm really not comfortable pulling the cams to swap shims, take it to the garage then, because I've done all the other maintenance before then myself and saved a bunch of money. So I understand where you're coming from, where the nexus is. And I guess I don't really know. The nexus is buying a modern vintage bike instead of a vintage bike. The recommendation I always provide to people, or always recommend, is like, someone brings me a motorcycle and they're like, oh, I want this to be my daily rider. And I'm like, have this be your Sunday rider.
Right.
That you ride one Sunday a month because it only starts one Sunday out of the 4, and then have a modern bike like a Bonneville or one of the others that's going to start every time and it's going to have ABS and fuel injection. Right. So I think you gotta, if you really want to embrace that vintage life, you can be a complete wackadoodle like some guy I saw on a handshift Harley riding down Long Beach Boulevard the other week, or you can be a rational person and unfortunately have to spend a little bit more money, but have both. Have an actual vintage bike and then have a modern vintage bike. A retro modern.
And I think even with the modern ones, like you're still going to get a little bit of wrenching experience for people that want a taste of it. You have to adjust your chain. You have to, chains and sprockets still wear out. There's going to be maintenance things you can do without having to say, okay, I have to go rebuild the carburetor, or I have, again.